Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel, and if you're new to the channel, well, my name's Stuart and I'm an RPG guy. Now someone in your life might not be an RPG guy, whether it be your significant other or best friend, but if you want to make them into an RPG guy, well, coming up I'm going to show you 5 options that might just help you do that. Now, rather than just throw my top 5 favourite RPGs of all time down your throats like I would normally do, what I've done this time is carefully selected, yes, picked out 5 different RPGs, slightly different styles, certainly different art styles, and most definitely different lengths. Because when it comes to RPGs, the number one reason that people say that they don't want to get into them, they don't play them and they don't enjoy them, is they take too long to play. Well, hopefully this list here is going to show you that that's not always the case. So let's start off with the first game that I'm going to recommend for a non-RPG guy to get into RPG, and that is none other than South Park: The Stick of Truth.
Humans and elves of Sauron, a great evil has descended upon us. I believe we are facing a threat to our entire world. Our only hope is for our 2 factions to join forces. Tonight, we are no longer elves, goths, or girls. Tonight, we fight as one! Fuck that! We do not...
Now, The Stick of Truth was released in 2014, so it's a fairly recent game. And let's just go over some pros and cons of playing South Park: The Stick of Truth as a way to get you into RPGs. Now, the first absolutely, without a doubt, pro or argument for is the length of the game. This game here will only take you, say, 10 hours at most to complete the main storyline, and if you want to experience absolutely everything that the game's got to offer, then it's going to be 20 hours, probably most at the max. So it's not a long game. This is a relatively short game that you can play in 1 or 2 sittings depending on how long you've got to dedicate your gaming time to that day, and you'll get through it. And that is one of the main arguments that you hear time and time again from people who don't play RPGs, is that they just don't have the time to play them. Now, the second argument for, the second pro for The Stick of Truth is quite simply the humour. This game is absolutely packed with humour, as you can imagine it would be, because it is based on South Park, and I'm sure everyone out there watching this does know of at least South Park. And that being the case, how could it not have the same humour in it? Well, it does. It is packed from start to finish with South Park humour, and if that's your thing, you will absolutely love this game. And the third pro or argument for The Stick of Truth is going to be the menu interface, which is quite modern, and that's simply because you're playing as a South Park character, one of your own design, of course, being an RPG, and they access their own menu by using their smartphone. So it's an interface that you're going to be aware of. It's something that won't be alien to you. So for the most part, you're not going to be looking at the complicated numbers and upgrade paths that you may have seen in previous RPGs. Now, of course, you can't have pros or arguments for without cons. Yes, we need to have some considerations in here as well. And the first consideration, whether you're thinking this is your way into RPGs or not, is you do need a 13-year-old sense of humour. The humour is at toilet level, without a doubt, but it is fantastic where it is at that. But as you can see, a lot of pros can become cons quite quickly. So if you don't have the stomach for toilet humour, then you probably want to shy away from this one, because it is literally packed from start to finish with that classic South Park humour that if you don't enjoy it, you just won't enjoy it. Now, consideration number 2 is that this game actually can be deceptively quite complex. I did mention that one of the arguments for was the modern interface. It's a menu interface that you're going to know and understand and be able to use quite easily. But what's hidden deep within there is a lot of complexity when you take a proper look at it. Now you don't have to of course go into that depth, and that's probably why, although the game is a 10-hour game for story, it's a 20, so it doubles its length in essence when you start to really dig into the game. So in many ways that can be another pro, that if you do get into this game, which can be deceptively complex, it's going to teach you a lot more about RPGs than you ever did know before. And consideration number 3 is that there's some obscure puzzles in this game. To work your way through to different levels or different areas in the game, you might have to think slightly outside the box and try and think inside the South Park box. Now of course we do have the internet and Google if we get truly stuck these days, so that's not going to be a huge issue, but it's something that you should be aware of. If puzzles that are not quite as logical as you'd like them to be aren't your thing, then there's going to be a few of these moon logic puzzles in this game. So game number 1, South Park The Stick of Truth, and is this going to be the RPG that gets your non-RPG buddy into RPGs? Who knows, give them a try. If they're a fan of South Park, this could be their hook in. Now for the second game that could draw your non-RPG buddy into playing RPGs, well, I've chosen Lord of the Rings The Third Age.
A man, badly wounded.
Wait for the wargs to approach.
They'll kill him. Hold on!
Hello, lovelies.
You live?
No thanks to you.
Now many people probably are well aware of Lord of the Rings, and of course that is the first pro or the first argument for introducing this game to someone who hasn't played RPGs. If they know and love Lord of the Rings, well, this is one of the hooks that will get them in. And I will be honest with you, completely honest, I am a huge fan of this series, not only just the movies that came out in the 2000s, but of course the books. I had read all the books beforehand, and I do love Lord of the Rings. This game does the movies justice, and the movies had enough of the books in them to do the books justice as well. So your first pro is, if you have a Lord of the Rings fan who's not an RPG fan, this game could definitely hook them into this genre. Now the second pro for this game, well, it's quite simple. It's a very linear game. There's no way to get lost in this game. You go from A to B, from B to C, and so on. There's nothing much to do that will get you lost in any way, shape or form, which is another thing that many non-RPG people don't like. They don't like the fact that maybe they just don't know how to get to that next area, how to work out that next problem or puzzle to advance the story, and that drives them crazy. This won't do it. It's a very linear story, and it's got a very linear map system as well. You won't get lost in this game, so that's definitely a pro when it comes to a non-RPG player coming in to trying to play an RPG for the first time. And the third argument for the Lord of the Rings The Third Age is the upgrade path. Now upgrade paths of course are something that you need in an RPG. Your character has to grow and develop and get new skills and so on. With the Lord of the Rings The Third Age, the upgrade path is very detailed but very clear and concise. There's no way to get lost. There's no way to make a decision where your character's not going to follow the build that you eventually want them to build. It lays this all out in detail for you. It shows you quite clearly how to get your character from one strength to another, and makes it incredibly clear how to do that as well. So if you had a player out there who doesn't play RPGs, and one of the reasons is they don't know how to build their character, well, this game holds your hand through that from start to finish, so that is not a concern when it comes to Lord of the Rings The Third Age. Now of course we have to talk about the arguments against, and probably the first argument against I would have for this particular game is it has low replayability. Once you've played through this game, which will take you 20 hours and at max 30 to get full completion and explore everything in the game, as you can see there, you're not getting much extra time on, because everything that you do from start to finish, because it's so linear, you tend to do it in your first playthrough, and there's not much in there else once you've played it. You might of course be a huge Lord of the Rings fan and throw this on every year, but unless you are absolutely invested in the Lord of the Rings story, this game you're going to play once. But of course, if it hooks you into playing RPGs and gets you along that path, that can only be a good thing anyway. But the con being, you'll only play this game once probably. The second consideration is, well, there's not very many secrets in the game. There are things to find and discover of course, but they're all laid out for you. As again, this goes back to one of the pros for this game. It is very linear, but being very linear means there's not much to explore, there's not many secrets to find after your initial playthrough. And if it does hook you into being an RPG player, then this is a game that you're probably not going to go back to. Unless of course you're like me, as I've said time and time again, and a huge fan of the franchise. And the third and final consideration is that character leveling up is limited to each individual character. Now, if you're not an RPG player, you probably don't really understand this, but there's two ways for a character to level up, or at least the characters in your party to level up, and that is either the whole party gains experience in a battle, or only one person gains experience in a battle, and that's what happens in here. Now of course, to gain experience in this game, you have to use that character and use whatever abilities they have, and if they're continually doing that, they will be gaining their own experience as the battles go on. But you have to do this individually for each character. Now of course, this takes us back to one of the pros, one of the arguments for, and that is because there's such a detailed progression line when it comes to upgrading and developing your characters, that you have to do it individually for each and every one of them. That can be a bit of a put off for some people. Some people like a whole party experience build at the same time, but this one you're not going to get that. Each and every one of these characters you have to look after and care for like a beloved Tamagotchi every time you play the game, so you must keep that in mind if you're thinking about Lord of the Rings The Third Age, to draw your non-RPG buddy into RPGs. Now the third game that I'm going to recommend that you give your non-RPG buddy to make them an RPG buddy, well, that is Grandia II from Ubisoft in 2000.
So filled with power.
You better practice if you want to beat me.
The first argument for Grandia 2 will be the combat system. It's not your traditional combat system that you see in most early JRPGs and RPGs, where one party, your party, faces up against the enemy party and you take one turn, then they take one turn, and so on. Hence the reason it was called turn-based combat. There is turn-based combat in this, but it's an active time battle combat, so different characters move at different speeds, meaning there's a bit more strategy when it comes to who to hit first and who to hit last. And not only that, you could move your characters around the field of battle. You weren't just facing off one side against the other, you had a whole area in which your character could move around in to avoid area of effect spells and other such attacks like that. And just for the icing on the cake, you had the ability to cancel an opponent's turn. So if you were taking your turn, if it got to the point where your main character was allowed to make his decision on what attack he was going to make, well, he could choose to make an attack that would cancel the turn of the next opponent, which could give you the advantage of your character or the next character in your party attacking next. Fantastic strategy. Not overly complex, although it maybe sounds like that, because the game does kind of hold your hand in the combat for a little bit, but only enough just so you get to grips with it, as of course with all games, as the game moves on it gets more complicated and much more involved. But to start with, this game will certainly suck you in with its combat system. Now the second pro or argument for this game will be the simplified skill tree. Much like the combat, it holds your hand. It doesn't make things overly complicated in this game, at least not at the beginning. It's a great game for getting you in on an entry level for JRPGs and RPGs, because it helps the player along, especially in the early days. And to be honest with you, truly great RPGs don't just throw you in and expect you to be able to manipulate all the complicated stats that you get in these RPG games. No, what they should do is come in and show you how to play the game at the beginning and give you the tools required to, well, get good at it. And that is something that Grandia II certainly does. And the third pro, well, quite simply, it's the characters. They're fun and interesting, and they have a lot of dialogue between each other. You get to know the characters, and that is one of the most important things in any RPG, and that is whether, well, especially a JRPG, is whether you get to know and empathise and start to really enjoy spending time with the characters in the story. And Grandia 2 doesn't let you down with the character development. It has a range of party members that you'll meet, and of course a range of adversaries that you'll have to take on, and each and every one of them is interesting and unique in their own way, and you do get the opportunity to get to know them quite well. So the third pro, the third argument for, is without a doubt the fun and interesting characters in the game. So we need some considerations now, some arguments against, and the first one for Grandia 2, well, there's going to be a lot of reading in it. There's not a lot of voice acting. Everything that's story-wise, everything that you need to get into the game in depth is all in text, so you're going to have to read in this game. And that, yes, is something that non-RPG players claim to be one of the things that put them off RPGs, and that's just the simple fact of having to read the story. And you will have to do that in Grandia 2, but let me tell you, it's still worth playing it. Now, the second argument against Grandia 2 that you're going to have to take into consideration is, well, the repetitive cutscenes in battles. Now, this is something that you'll see in a lot of JRPGs. If you launch a special move in battle, you'll get a cutscene. With Grandia 2, yes, they are still pretty to watch the first couple of times, but like every other JRPG that employs this technique, they do start to grate after a while, especially if you're using the same move over and over again to beat a high level boss. So watch out for the repetitive cutscenes in Grandia 2. Now, the third consideration, the third and final argument against introducing your non-RPG buddy to Grandia 2 is quite simply, it's an early PlayStation 2 game, released in 2000, so it's got early PlayStation 2 graphics. It doesn't look stunning in places, but there are places where it does absolutely look stunning. But for the point of the consideration, yes, it's going to look old, it's going to look a bit dated, and that just might not be your cup of tea. But if you can get over it, it's not a great big deal in the whole scheme of things. So Grandia 2 is definitely a game that you should consider introducing your non-RPG buddy to in order to make them an RPG buddy. Now, the fourth game that I'm going to recommend that you introduce to your non-RPG buddy to make them an RPG buddy is none other than Final Fantasy VII. And yes, I know a lot of people out there are going, yes, you knew he was going to talk about Final Fantasy VII, but of course I am, because this game is so apt for this list. It's a game obviously released by Squaresoft in 1997. It has 40 hours of main story gameplay and then an additional maybe 80 or more if you want to get everything out of the game. So yes, it's a big game, it has a lot of story, but it is a game that broke the Western market when it came to JRPGs. Bear that in mind. Now, the first, obviously, for this game, the first argument for, the first pro for me is the huge amount of content in this game. But despite having a huge amount of content, it's not overwhelming. There's no point in the game where you feel forced to get involved in all the extracurricular activities that this game can and does throw at you, and it will allow you just to progress your way through the story from A to B if that's how you want to play it. And if you come out on the other side of that story and absolutely love what you experienced, it's going to give you a reason to come back in and play it again and see what else you can eke out of the game. Secondly, one of the most important things when it comes to RPGs, and especially JRPGs, is the cast of characters, and Final Fantasy VII has a cast that you will love and hate but want in your life for the rest of eternity. Now, there are a lot of great games out there with a lot of great characters, but I dare anyone to find a game that has quite as many as Final Fantasy VII when it comes to characters that not only leave such an impact on you that they can have you in tears at time, but characters that you hate so much but wouldn't want to see gone. So without a doubt, the characters that you will discover and get to know in Final Fantasy VII are a huge argument for this game. And the third argument for, well, it's got a simple main story. Now, if you give a non-RPG guy a complicated story, then that's maybe a reason that they will decide not to play that game. Final Fantasy VII has a very simple linear main story. Now, that's not to say that the story is not complex, because that's the opposite in fact. Because if you really want to get everything out of this game, that 40-hour main story becomes 80 if you remember what I said back at the beginning. So if you can only try to imagine how many different narrative threads can weave its way in and out of the main story of this game to double the amount of playtime that you get, well, there you go, that's the answer. It has a simple story, it won't get you lost, it certainly won't get you too lost in a first playthrough, but let me tell you, it leaves those breadcrumbs in there to make you want to come back and just explore everything that you possibly missed in this game. Now, of course, there's got to be 3 arguments against, 3 things that you have to consider not to play Final Fantasy VII for, and I'll be frankly honest with you straight up that most of these are probably going to be a product of their time. The first one being that the game is graphically dated. It's a PlayStation game, right back in the first PlayStation, 1997, so it's fairly early on. It wasn't even originally developed for the PlayStation, so there'll be considerations from that in the game. And the polygonal graphics, the low polygonal graphics that we're not quite used to today might not quite interest everyone. If you can get over the graphics and start to discover the gameplay, however, that's a different kettle of fish. But yes, first consideration is it's not going to look like a game that you play these days. Second consideration, again another product of its time, although probably more of an issue coming from where the game was originally developed to be on, and that is a lack of voice acting. There is a lot of reading in this game. I don't think there's quite as much as there was in Grandia II, but if you want to go through the story, you're going to have to read. The characters don't talk to each other, not verbally, and it's just something that you have to put up with if you're playing an RPG from this era. Now, the third argument against introducing Final Fantasy VII to your non-RPG buddy, well, it's complicated to complete, and there's a lot of people out there that don't like playing games they can't fully complete. To fully complete Final Fantasy VII, you really have to invest yourself in the game. There's just no two ways about it, and that's not just completing the story or finding hidden parts of the story or trying to work out what the story actually means in the end, but some of the things that you have to or don't have to do in this game that are hidden in this game, there's a few secrets, let's just say that. And to get the absolute most out of it, you're going to have to invest a lot of time, sweat and tears into this game if you want to fully complete it. But Final Fantasy VII, there you go, that's 3 arguments for and 3 arguments against introducing this to your non-RPG buddy. Now, the 5th and final game that I'm going to recommend, that you recommend to your non-RPG buddy to make them an RPG buddy, is, well, it's the longest game in the list obviously, it's also the newest game in the list, and that is Yakuza Like a Dragon, released in 2020 by the wonderful Sega, and it's going to take you 50 hours to complete the story alone, and then 100 plus if you want to get absolutely everything out of the game.
Growing up, all I ever wanted was to be a hero, just like the ones in my favorite video games.
Ichiban.
Why not become a hero at 40, right?
The Dragon Slayer!
Turns out, all a hero needs is a quest. I finally found mine, and I'm going to play it my way.
Now, why do I recommend this? Let's get straight into the pros. And the first one, well, it's a modern and established franchise. A lot of people out there who don't traditionally consider themselves RPG players will probably have maybe at least dipped into the Yakuza series at some point, because it's more of a brawler beat 'em up than it is a traditional RPG game. This, however, is a completely traditional JRPG turn-based game. Fantastic one at that, but it's a modern franchise that people will know and try to understand, and that might be the hook to get them in, the fact that it's a Yakuza game and not just that it's an RPG game. Now, the second argument for this game is the amount of mini games in it. Now, anyone who's played a Yakuza game will know that there is a selection of mini games throughout all the Yakuza games. This one is no exception, so if you get bored, or your non-JRPG, your non-RPG buddy gets bored of playing the turn-based combat part of the game, they can go to Club Sega and play some Space Harrier or some Virtua Fighter or whatever else they want to do. Whether it's the mini golf mini game or the baseball mini game, you can even play darts in the game. So yes, without a doubt, there's something in this to distract you from the turn-based combat if you just want a break from it. And that's the second reason I would suggest you introduce this to a non-RPG buddy. And the third argument for, well, it's simply the levelling up is cross-party. So no longer will you have one member of your party that you don't use in battle from time to time remaining at level 2 while everyone else is level 40. The whole party, whether they're used or not, level up in this game, which was certainly a big draw for even me, and I'm an RPG guy, so it's something that will help out a non-RPG guy too. Now, of course, we have to have the considerations. We have to work out why a non-RPG guy or buddy wouldn't want to play this particular game. And the first one, well, it's the length. It's a long one. It's 50 hours at least to complete the main story, and if you want everything out of the game, it's over 100 hours. It's as simple as that. This is a time sink, and it's probably not going to be the game that you will get a non-RPG buddy into straight away, unless they are a big fan of Yakuza. So bear in mind just how long this game actually is. The second thing you'll have to take into consideration is that there is a couple of steep curves in this game when it comes to a few of the battles. For the majority of the game, you can breeze through most of the battles quite simply and grind without too much stress to get to a point you need to be. There are, however, a couple of battles in this game where, well, it's going to take you by surprise and you're going to realise that you're just not levelled enough. It does only happen a couple of times in the game, but it's enough to put off a new player to the RPG genre. So be aware of a couple of steep curves when it comes to a couple of the battles in this game. And the third and final argument against it you'll have to take into consideration as well, it goes back to one of the pros, and that is the sheer amount of content in this game. It can be quite overwhelming. It can get to a point where you don't know not only what you should be doing, but what you want to be doing as well. There are so many mini games, there's so many little areas that are secret that you have to discover. There's just so much story in the main story itself that this game can be quite literally overwhelming, especially for someone not used to the RPG genre. So bear in mind, if you're going to introduce Like a Dragon to your non-RPG buddy, they're going to have to cope with a lot being thrown at them, and a lot being thrown at them all the time. So there you go, my friends, that's 5 RPGs to make your non-RPG buddy your RPG buddy. And because I love the interaction between you and me, I want you to drop down in the comments, one, if you're an RPG fan already, whether I've made a good selection here, if this selection of RPGs is something that you would maybe suggest to a non-RPG fan, and if you're not an RPG fan, have any of these games wet your whistle for the genre again? Any of them piqued your interest? Because I would love to know that too. Thank you very much for watching as always, and until next time, cheerio!